Study Basers! In this lesson, we're going to talk about what are often called grace notes. Now, the term grace note is really a catch-all term for a number of different musical articulations or ornaments. And what we'll do in this lesson is talk about the terms that you'll most often hear being a bass player, and then what you'll find in music for the bass, and how it's notated, and I'll give you a bunch of tips on how to play them. What is a grace note? Well, defining it simply, a grace note is a quick note which leads or resolves into some main note, or principal note as it's called. So traditionally, grace notes are a step above or below in the key, but it could also be a chromatic note from outside of the key. Now on the bass, they're almost always half steps and whole steps from below or above the target note. And most of the time you're playing them as hammer-ons, pull-offs, or slides, rather than plucking the notes individually. The most well-known type of grace note is called an appoggiatura. We'll get into the details of their notation shortly, but they look like this. It's a smaller sized note connected to some other note. Now, the word appoggiatura comes from Italian and means to lean into. And that's really a good way to describe the sound. One note leans into the next. An appoggiatura is a note played on the beat, momentarily displacing some main note before you resolve to it. So, again, one note is leaning into that next note. Now, you might recognize the sound of appoggiaturas from other instruments like piano. Now, you might wonder, why don't they just write out the notes like normal notes? Well, the appoggiatura has some other characteristics, like being accented more loudly, and it's typically a non-harmonic tone resolving to a harmonic one. So, for example, on a C major chord, the note D may lead into E, the third of the C chord. Now, you might see appoggiaturas in music for the bass, but it's much more likely that they'll just be written out like plain hammer-ons and pull-offs and slides. But you need to know this term appoggiatura because many musicians will use it, and it's going to help you understand our next topic. What we see more of on the bass are called acciaccaturas. An acciaccatura is very short. It's often described as a short appoggiatura. Now, the word acciaccatura comes from Italian and it means to crush. So think of this as quickly crushing two notes together. How long you hold the acciaccatura is really open to interpretation by the player. Depending on your own musical judgment, you might want a long one, or you might want a short one. Now, people also debate whether or not the acciaccatura is played on the beat, or if the principal main note should land on the beat. When you can, listen to the recording and try to emulate how the original bass player played it. Why would you want to use a grace note? Well, one reason is for the musical tension that they produce. So most grace notes are dissonant notes resolving to consonant notes. And that can make a plain note more exciting. So instead of this, we get this. Just the sound of a quick hammer-on or pull-off or slide can make a note a little bit more interesting or exciting. Another reason you might use them is for the melodic quality that they can add to notes. So instead of this, you can have this. For bass players, the most common grace note is the hammer-on acciaccatura. But slides are also common. And pull-offs also happen, but they're a little bit more rare. Now, all of the technical issues that are common with hammer-ons, pull-offs, and slides still apply. So let's look at some issues that you might experience with grace notes. With the hammer-on, remember to get a clear sound, you want to make sure that your starting note is fully pressed before you pluck and hammer on. So if you're not fully pressed, it won't ring out. Likewise, when you do a pull-off, make sure that the target note is fully pressed before you pull off. Again, if it's not going to ring out. When you slide a grace note, remember to land right behind the fret. Again, if you don't, it's not going to sound right. The most common mistake that students make when they play acciaccaturas is that they play the two notes too slowly and too far apart. So instead of, they play, and that's more like just a common hammer-on. Now, the trick here is to hear the notes in your mind as a single event. Don't hear it as two different notes, hear it as one unit. So instead of hearing bip bip, hear it as brip. The appoggiatura is notated as a note in a smaller font size, and it's written traditionally as half the rhythmic value of its principal note. And it's often connected with a slur. You should remember that the rhythms within each bar need to add up to the number of beats in the time signature. So if we have a time signature of 4/4, that means we need to have rhythms that add up to 4 quarter notes. Now, the rhythmic value of the appoggiatura and acciaccatura don't count towards that rhythmic total. So you ignore it. Instead, you subtract the length of time that you play it from the principal note. Acciaccaturas are notated just like the appoggiatura, except they have a small slash through the note stem. And these are the grace notes that you'll see much more often in bass music. In bass tab, grace notes like the appoggiatura and acciaccatura are notated with a smaller font and a hammer-on or pull-off slur or a slide mark. And sometimes you might see parentheses around them. Once again, you'll find a number of grace note exercises that I created on studybass.com. And there's also a list of suggested songs for you to listen to and learn to play. Grace notes don't happen too often, but when they do, they can really add a lot. What often brings music to life is the sum of many subtle elements, just like these grace notes.